Exposed nuclear fuel rods raise fears of overheating at Japan's Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant. It follows a second explosion at the facility. And tens of thousands of people are still missing after Friday's tsunami, with many remote towns and villages still cut off.
Japan relies about 30% for its power supply on nuclear energy. This country has a long nuclear history, both good and bad. Of course, there were the two explosions at the end of the Second World War, so they know an awful lot, far too much, about the devastating effects of radiation, which is why this particular question is being watched so closely here. Now, what exactly is the science, and what are the perils of what is going on inside these reactors? Our science correspondent, David Shukman, has the answers.
Near the nuclear power station today, a scene that most people would dread. A test for radioactive contamination. As the authorities struggle to control the reactors, the key question is whether the risks are escalating. The installation took a real pounding. This picture was taken before the disaster. Here it is just after. Much of the site black with mud from the tsunami, which also wrecked the backup power. And here it is today, with two of the reactor buildings destroyed. Crucially, though, the reactors inside are thought to be intact. That's the assessment of the International Atomic Energy Agency. Its experts are monitoring the disaster, and they believe the vessels holding the reactors and the main containment systems have not been damaged.
Reactor vessels and primary containment vessels. These are designed to prevent the massive release of radioactivity, stay intact. As a result, the release of radioactivity is limited.
Questions have been raised about several nuclear power stations, but especially the two at Fukushima on the coast, with the station known as Daiichi now the scene of a frantic effort. What's meant to happen inside a nuclear power station is this. In the reactor, the rods of nuclear fuel go through the process of fission, the atoms splitting and releasing energy. Water is pumped in and flows around the fuel, where it heats up and turns into steam. That drives generators to make electricity. But if a reactor runs dry, as one did today, the fuel rods overheat and melt, and that may have started in 3 reactors. The nuclear fuel could then sink to the bottom of the reactor, the beginning of what's known as meltdown. But provided the steel wall of the container does its job, there shouldn't be a leak. No one can get close to check exactly what's happening. These shots were filmed before the earthquake, so how bad could things get? Well, they tried several times today to pump water into one of the reactors, like in this training exercise, but they kept failing. What could follow? We asked the British government's chief scientist.
In that situation, you would get an explosion and radioactive material would be emitted, but it would be emitted to about 500 meters, and it would be a relatively short duration of the order of an hour or so. Compare that with Chernobyl, which is a really serious event, where the top blew off the reactor.
The Chernobyl accident 25 years ago spewed a radioactive cloud over hundreds of miles. But it's thought this is highly unlikely in Japan, mainly because the Japanese reactors are better protected. Even so, how far could any radiation spread? The winds have been changeable, but luckily a Met Office forecast says they'll now blow out to sea. The explosion this morning, the second in 48 hours, did not cause a major radioactive leak, but it injured 11 workers, and the risk of another blast makes the fight for control all the harder. David Shukman, BBC News.
Well, let me just bring you up to date of the developments since David filed that piece. There has, as we now know, been a third explosion. It took place in Reactor 2 of the Fukushima power plant at 6:10 this morning, local time. Now, we gather that there are reports that the containment wall around the nuclear reactor, made of steel, may, and I repeat the word may, have been breached. There's also a report on the Kyoto news agency that the radiation levels are now reaching their legally highest level. I'm not sure exactly what that means, but I can tell you that those radiation levels are heading in the wrong direction.
Now let's just take you back to Japan and more on that breaking news. The reports that another large explosion has been heard at the Fukushima nuclear plant in northeast Japan. Nuclear officials are saying there are indications that the containment vessel housing the number 2 reactor may have been damaged, may have been breached in the blast. Some staff have been evacuated. That was 6:10 this morning local time. Latest we're hearing is that radiation levels in the air surrounding the plant have risen 4-fold after that explosion. The radiation reading is now to 8,217 microsieverts an hour. Now, the point of that is the Japanese authorities are saying levels would need to reach 1 million or so before causing large-scale radiation sickness. And I repeat, those levels are currently reading, we are told by officials, 8,217. Just a short while ago, Tokyo Electric confirmed there'd been a blast and some staff have been evacuated. This is what an official had to say.
At Fukushima number 1 nuclear power plant, number 2 reactor, at 6:14 a.m., there was a blast heard near the suppression pool, and the pressure began to fall in the suppression pool. We are continuing the water injection into the pressure of vessels, but the operators who are not directly engaged in this operation are being ordered to be evacuated to safer locations. At Fukushima number 1 nuclear power plants, the operators are doing their best to contain this problem. There's no significant change in the parameters with regard to container vessels, and we apologize for causing the concerns and inconvenience to the public.
Official there from Tokyo Electric Power Company, speaking, of course, through an interpreter.
Well, let's get more now on the dangers posed by the second explosion at the Fukushima nuclear power plant and the news that another reactor at the plant has developed problems with its cooling systems. The BBC's environment correspondent Richard Black is with us now. Just first of all, on these unconfirmed reports of fuel rods being exposed by falling water levels.
That's right. This is in the number 2 reactor, and this is news just in from one news agency, so I think we have to call it unconfirmed at the moment. Earlier, the company that operates the plant had reported that coolant levels were low in this particular reactor. Now, if what has happened, what may have happened is that simply the coolant has come out of the system. This will leave the reactor core rods exposed. There is nothing then to cool them down. There will be some serious melting, one can presume, going on inside there, potentially quite serious.
And that is what we've all been fearing, isn't it? If it's basically, it still has to be contained within the core.
Yes, basically it can go up to temperatures of many hundreds of degrees Celsius, and the issue then is whether the containment will actually succeed in containing this blob of melting metal. If it has happened, it's very serious, but as I say, we've only got it from one source at the moment, so we should be a little cautious,
And
I
just
think.
take us back quickly over the last couple of days as to what's happened.
Sure. Well, over the weekend we first had this very dramatic explosion at the number 1 reactor and subsequently at the number 3 reactor. Now, the cause of those seems to have been pretty much the same, a build-up of hydrogen which was caused by venting in order to get rid of dangerous pressure from within the actual containment vessel. So they vent this steam essentially out of the vessel. This then builds up inside the building shell, outside the containment thing that keeps all the reactor inside, but inside the building you then have that explosion which creates those very dramatic pictures. But the company has said after both of those explosions that the actual containment, the steel vessels, are intact. And if that is the case, then basically what we're talking about is perhaps a local event, nothing more serious.
That's the big if, though, isn't it? Because if the core container, for example, if these reports do turn out to be correct, that the fuel rods are exposed, the danger is then of a big leak. How far away from the plant are people in danger of something like that? I know that is perhaps quite a long way off and we shouldn't scare people, but... It's
a very difficult scenario to try and predict. Basically, you've got to have some sort of release of material. Now, in the case of the Chernobyl accident, for example, the really dangerous stuff was that there was an explosive release of gas and a fire, and this put material into the air that went for thousands of kilometres. Now, we haven't had this at Fukushima. The other scenario that was projected in the film, the China syndrome back in the 70s, and which was raised around the time of the 3 Mile Island incident in the US was meltdown, where the reactor core goes through the bottom of the reactor building essentially and into the earth. We haven't really had one of those, so trying to project what might happen is very, very difficult. But those would be the two scenarios that could lead to widespread loss of radioactive material from the plant.
OK, Richard Black, thanks very much indeed. Reuters again just reporting that water levels are almost empty according to the power plant's operator, but as I said, we can't confirm that as yet.
The Japanese authorities are saying a third explosion has been heard at Reactor 2 at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant. There are fears the containment vessel housing the reactor may have been damaged in the blast. Officials are now saying radiation levels around the plant have risen fourfold, but they do say that those levels are nowhere near yet the levels needed to cause large-scale radiation sickness.
Japan's stock market tumbles yet again, extending their worst losses in over 2.5 years. And nuclear power, a friend or a foe to Asia's energy-hungry economies? Explosions at Japan's nuclear reactors and power facilities have raised serious environmental concerns and fears over the impact on human health. But nuclear-generated power plays such a vital role in Japan. The country began relying on nuclear power as far back as the 1960s. More than 50 nuclear reactors now supply 1/3 of the country's electricity. And its role before the earthquake was expected to expand. Not just Japan, you also have China, increasingly dependent on nuclear power. It already has 13 reactors in operation, with many more either already under construction or in the planning stages. Asia's largest economy's nuclear power capacity is expected to jump tenfold over the next several decades. And in India, nuclear-generated electricity may account for 25% of the country's total output by 2050 from just 2.5% today. Earlier I had a chat with Benjamin Sovakul from the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy and the author of Second Thoughts on Nuclear Power. I started by asking him the impact economically and environmentally.
I think any way you look at it, the costs of nuclear power plants are too high compared to other alternatives. The cost of building a plant, it's often 2 to 3 times as much as you anticipate. There have been numerous studies looking at construction costs in India and France and the United States, and you have cost overruns, factors of 2 or 3. So a plant is supposed to cost $5 billion, ends up costing $15 billion, which triples then the production cost and the cost you have to pay for ratepayers. And the other big issue with cost is let's make sure we actually do full accounting that accounts for all of the costs of nuclear power. So not just the cost of building a plant, but let's say decommissioning that power facility, storing its nuclear waste, maybe making the subsidies that supported its research and development transparent, which even add more to the cost of a power.
A mountain of risks for nuclear power, but you have the likes of Japan, China, and India building nuclear facilities faster than any other country in the world.
Yeah. But they've been building nuclear facilities for the past 2 decades, and they're not making a lot of progress. India is meeting less than 3% of their needs from nuclear power. It's always 20 years away that they'll make huge leaps to thorium reactors. China has currently stalled a lot of their plants, right? They're still under construction. They're taking far longer to build than initially projected. And if you look at it, all of these countries have had nuclear power before. Newcomer countries, countries that are adopting it for the first time, it's Iran and North Korea and no others. Right? So if it's so attractive, how come other countries aren't investing in it?
The bottom line is, Benjamin, what is the best option right now for the consumer? Nuclear power, alternative, renewable, or fossil fuel?
Renewable will be my take, and I think that there are 2 technologies that are especially least cost. Wind energy, onshore wind turbines produce electricity very affordably. That's why there have been more of them installed in the US and Europe than coal for the past 3 to 4 years. The second is waste to energy. Landfill gas capture, waste incineration. We have mountains of waste around the world that you can easily use to convert into electricity and reduce landfill space. Both of these produce electricity for about 4 to 6 US cents per kilowatt hour, which is even cheaper than building a new coal plant or natural gas plant.
Benjamin Sovakul from the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy.